In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
I've been very fortunate to have the family gathering as I prepare for my 50th. And of course, with my sister at the table, who doesn't visit very often, from Queensland, and various other people around the table, the family anecdotes flow, which is fun sometimes. My mother reminded us that when she was a newlywed, she went to a Bible study that she was invited to in the Sydney parish. I won't say which parish. But when she finished at the Bible study, the rector called her aside and said, Jill, I'd just like to ask if it would be okay. We'd rather you didn't attend Bible study anymore. And she quizzically looked at him and said, what's the problem? And he said, you're asking a bit too many questions. And it's funny, I can understand the impulse. People's questions are sometimes the bane of many clergy's existences because they ask questions that are tricky, awkward, or put you on the spot. But I mean, asking questions is a very important part of growing in the faith. If you can't ask, how do you learn? And when people ask you questions, they refine exactly what they're looking for. Quite often, a lot of our pastoral work is teaching people to ask the questions that they need to ask, or ask them better. Because quite often when we ask our first question, it's not the right question. So part of the pastoral work of every priest is to help people ask their questions better, or ask better questions. And in that vein, there was one question that I got in my ministry, and thankfully I didn't say to the person, I'm sorry, you can't come anymore. But this lady was a lady in her mid-40s. At the time I was only in my late 20s, and she was a mother of two girls who were both sort of young teens. And she said in a group that I was leading, I don't understand how to discern the way forward, how to make decisions. And I said to her, what do you mean? And she said, I don't know how people understand that the decisions they make are of God, that they're godly decisions. How do I know I'm not just deceiving myself when I make a decision about my family, or about my life, or about my girls? How do I know that that's come from God and not just somewhere else, somewhere more sinister, or just my own thoughts? How do I know it's God's, God-breathed, God-inspired, the Holy Spirit-driven? How do I know that? And of course, I found that very hard to answer. Because discerning how to make big decisions is a tough one. I don't know how you make yours when you've got to say we've got to sell our home, or we've got to buy a new car, or we're going on an extended holiday, or we've got to have surgery, or whatever it might be. How do we make that decision? How do we know that the decision we're making is of God? So I found that question very difficult, and I've got to tell you, in the 3 years I was in the parish, I was never able to fully look her in the eye and answer that question. But in a sense, to me, the questions that dog us, as it were, the questions that continue to reoccur and to make our lives slightly uncomfortable, these are questions that from time to time need attention. But sometimes I think it's not necessarily the right question we're asking. So if we're getting a question that can't have an answer, maybe we need a new question, is what I'm saying. I'm not saying don't worry about that question. I'm saying think about that question from a different point of view. Ask another question similar to it. As I said a moment ago, asking the right questions can be very important. Remember I was telling you about that wonderful joke about the man who's in the restaurant and he calls the waiter across and he says, can you taste my soup? And the waiter says, what's wrong with your soup? Is it too cold or too hot or something? He says, no. He says, it's too spicy. No. Just taste my soup. And eventually he says, fine, I'll taste your soup. Where's the spoon? He goes,
That's right. Very true.
It's about asking the right question. Sometimes the questions we're asking don't go anywhere, or they're not helpful, or they've got no response, no easy response. So how do we ask a better question? How do we ask a better question? And I can think of lots of questions that really don't go very far. I remember having a parishioner once come to me and said, I've just come back to church, and ever since I've come back to church, my life's been a disaster. Why is it that my life is a disaster now that I've come back to church? Now, how do I answer that question? But there's probably a better question to ask here. That's not the right one, and it has no response, incidentally. So how do we ask better questions? How do we get ourselves in a different space, I guess is what I'm saying. And when I read about the calling of Matthew, which I think is always fascinating on this day to celebrate the Apostle Matthew, I think about the way in which Jesus was continually trying to get his opponents, because part of the calling of Matthew is this idea that they were grumbling all the time because Matthew was seen as part of the tax collector outsider group. Why do you mix with these people, they say? Why is it you are doing this? And Jesus tries to turn it on its head continuously, saying to them, do you think I've come in order to congratulate you all on what a great job you're doing? I don't come for the well. I don't come for the people who are fine. I come for the people who are struggling. You've got to turn your thinking around about what God is really on about here. And in Paul's language, he calls this by a Greek word, he calls this change, I know we're used to the word metanoia, the change of heart or change of mind, but he uses another word, Paul, called phronema, which means mindset. Where is your mindset? How is your mind sitting towards the things in your life? And the more I think about phronema, mindset, the more I think it's important to get your mind right. I think Paul was onto something with that phrase that Jesus also typified in the way in which he tried to work with people to get their mindset in a different direction. And the more I see also of the struggles that people have as they get older with their whole mental processes, the more I realise that mindset is really important. It's kind of the way in which you approach everything in your life. Recently we lost, what's his name, Danny Frawley? Do you remember the AFL player from St Kilda?
Yes. And
we found out that he ran himself off the road and killed himself. And it was a great tragedy. And I was used to watching him on the Bounce, the show The Bounce, which is an AFL commentary show, fun show. And very buoyant, very fun sort of guy, and a great player in AFL back in the 80s, I think. But he struggled with a lot of mental health issues, as many people do. And at 56, he could cope with it no longer. And as I get older, and I'm very aware of that at the moment, of getting into that new bracket, but as I get older, I realise how important it is to keep my mind in a good space, to keep my heart and mind, if you like, that part of my soul in a good space. Because if I don't, I can lead myself into terrible areas of my life, or put myself in great danger. And of course, in the process of putting myself in danger, I put other people in danger too, people that rely on me. So I need to keep my head in a good space. And in relation to that, when I hear people ask questions that I think are awkward or show a bit of pain or anxiety, for example, the person I said a moment ago who said, why since I've come back to church has my life become a disaster, that opens up a whole conversation of what it means to come back to church. What do you mean it's a disaster? Tell me what you were thinking would happen when you came back to church. What does it mean to be back at church for you? You know, there are a whole pile of questions to ask there that would refine that question, and maybe you could ask something better like, you know, how has coming back to church helped me now that my life has turned bad? That might be a better question to ask than church is punishing me, you know, for coming back, which is not the case. So one of the things I'm thinking about today as I look at the calling of Matthew and the question about including insiders is that Jesus and in Paul's writings as well, we're always challenged to get a good mindset, get a good space in which we look at the world, because it's very easy to fall away and begin to be cynical, be unhappy, be hypercritical, and basically visit all that sort of poisonous mindset on the people around us. There are lots of reasons why we can have that, but we need to keep our mind in a good space. So today I'm thinking about how I continue to propagate in my life a mindset that leads to a joy, a contentment, a thankfulness and gratitude for the things I have in my life. Knowing that it's not about what's happened or where I am, but it's about my attitude to that, the way in which I take hold of that and turn it into a kind of God's point of view or a God's way of seeing. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.